have Stacey Abrams.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Today's conversation regarding the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does occur against the backdrop of a resurgence of Jim Crow-style voter suppression measures sweeping across state legislatures, grounded in the big lie about fraud and insecurity in the 2020 election. As a necessary reminder, post-Reconstruction laws known as Jim Crow that targeted Black voters never explicitly excluded eligible citizens by race. Then, as now, the laws surgically aimed at behaviors to limit access. With hundreds of bills pending, a significant number of the worst attacks on the right to vote are made possible by the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision. That decision authorized states and localities with a history of voting discrimination to again impose limits, restrictions, and barriers to participation. The dramatic proliferation of state-level anti-voting laws across the country in 2021 demonstrates the urgent need for Congress to bring the VRA's pre-clearance formula into the modern era, to reinstate federal oversight over discriminatory voting practices, and to strengthen and protect voting rights wherever suppression occurs. Throughout its history, Georgia has been among the worst actors, including malicious prosecution of lawful absentee ballot users in 2010 and intimidation of Black voters by deputy sheriffs in 2015. Under pre-clearance, the Department of Justice objected to 170 discriminatory voting changes in Georgia at the state and local level. After Shelby removed pre-clearance, analysis showed that Black voters were 20% more likely than white voters to not vote due to poll closures, including an estimated 54,000 to 85,000 voters being unable to cast ballots in 2018 alone after 214 such poll closures. Had the VRA been in effect, these changes would have been examined by a federal court or the DOJ to determine whether they were discriminatory before being put into effect. Georgia voters are now anticipating the deleterious effects on elections created by Senate Bill 202, which relies on misinformation, falsehoods, and flawed analysis to restrict access for voters, primarily targeting communities of color. With dozens of attacks on voting rights embedded in the law, I will highlight only a few. Voters of color in Georgia were more likely than white voters to vote by mail for the first time in the last two election cycles. Suddenly, SB 202 shortens the time period to request or return an absentee ballot application and imposes new restrictive ID requirements that will have an amplified effect on disabled voters, older voters, voters of color, and Black Georgians in particular. Voters of color in Georgia are more likely than white voters to stand in long lines, including the 8-hour debacle that occurred in June 2020. SB 202 criminalizes a volunteer handing a bottle of water or food to voters or their children while in line. Across the country, these state laws target voters of color by restricting access to the ballot for Black, Latino, Asian American and Pacific Islander, and Native American communities. In Texas, Arizona, and Michigan, each are considering laws to restrict voting rights by people of color. When the fundamental right to vote is left to the political ambitions and prejudices of state actors, one who rely on suppression to maintain power, federal intercession stands as the appropriate remedy. Simply put, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is essential to the protection of democracy. Protecting voting rights has been a bipartisan endeavor since the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and through every subsequent reauthorization. While each of us may likely have a declared party loyalty, our first obligation is to the fundamental standards of democracy, which must be aggressively nonpartisan. Actions taken to restrict access, thwart participation, or discourage engagement are antithetical to our national creed and should be condemned by every patriot. Instead, we must advocate for voting rights, not to ensure the success of a single party or ideology, but to guarantee a vigorous and fair debate amongst Americans of goodwill. It is my profound hope that we will honor the legacy of my late friend, Congressman John Lewis, and the lives of those lost in the fight for a more perfect union by enacting critical legislation into law. I thank you for the opportunity to take part in this important discussion, and I urge you to continue to strengthen our democracy.
Thank you, Ms. Abrams. Let me concede at the outset that Jim Crow at its worst was more violent than the situation we face today. I don't want to recount all of the horrors of that bigotry and racism that occurred in that era. But I think the bottom line question, which we are addressing in this hearing, is whether there is a design or an intent in legislation that is being considered and passed in many states, including the state of Georgia, to limit or restrict the right to vote of minority populations with the intent of having influence on the outcome of the election. I think that goes without saying. Clearly, there's a difference in the witnesses who appear before the committee. But I'd like to ask Stacey Abrams, for example. The Speaker Pro Tem, Ms. Jones, said earlier that the new Georgia law made it easier to vote in the state. You've recounted a few instances, but can you think of elements in the law that was signed by Governor Kemp which do the opposite?
Well, first is this falsity that's been proposed that this is an expansion of rights. Let's be clear. In the state of Georgia, 60% of Georgians live in counties that already had, for example, 2 Saturdays of early voting. What has changed is that now additional counties will join the ranks, and that is a good thing. But at the same time that those counties will join those ranks, they have reduced mandatory dates. They have eliminated weeks of early voting during federal runoffs. And let's be very clear that federal runoffs in Georgia were predicated on a racist premise of eliminating access to the right to vote for African Americans. And they eliminate access to a mandatory weekend voting day. Another example is the falsity that this expands hours for voting. Yes, it codifies that you can vote between 9 to 5 as business hours. But for 78% of Georgians, prior to this bill, the hours for voting during early voting was 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So this actually eliminates hours of voting and mandates only a shortened period of time. That was the misunderstanding that I think is still misunderstood by the Washington Post, because early voting hours that exceed that are now optional and not mandatory. We have 78% of Georgians who had experienced longer voting hours and now will see shortened hours. In addition, there is a narrative that says that the use of a Social Security number is allowed for returning your absentee ballot if you do not have access to the ID. Well, let's be clear. You cannot apply for an absentee ballot with your Social Security number. You must have some forms of identification that are unavailable to currently 200,000 Georgians. Those are just a few of the issues. And I will certainly address the criminalization of the handing of water. We have to be clear that in the state of Georgia, 8-hour lines for communities of color has become not an unusual circumstance. Usually we've seen between 4 and 8-hour lines. People do not often come prepared to stand in line for the whole of a business day. They certainly don't often bring their food with them. And this ignores the fact that the overworked poll workers who are inside those buildings do not have the time to come out and hand out refreshments since they are busy processing so many voters who have been underserved. And so I would use those as a few examples of why this bill is deleterious in its effect and malicious in its intent.
Ms. Jones, I'd like to ask you to respond to this question. There was an allegation made by the former president of the United States relating to the voting in the state of Georgia. He went so far at one point in the recorded conversation to say that 5,000 dead people had voted. Mr. Raffensperger